Hello and welcome to Stand in the Gap. I'm Sam Rohrer, and I'll be joined again today by Pastor Isaac Crockett. On this program and on our Stand in the Gap Today national radio program, we regularly visit the nation of Israel, Jerusalem, and the Middle East because of its importance to biblical prophecy. Anything that God says is important should be important to us, and certainly that starts with the nation of Israel, God's covenant people, Israel, God's land that He gave to Israel, and Jerusalem, God's eternal city. And because of this, God is drawing the nations of the world to Israel, drawing the eyes of the world to Jerusalem. He directed President Trump to recognize Israel and Jerusalem as the capital. The recent announcements of the Abrahamic Accord, brokered by the United States, a peace treaty between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, with the promise for more to come, is significant. But what does it really mean? Will it really bring peace? What does God think about this plan as He has displayed His warning or His approval of this plan, as He has done with other attempts since Israel became a nation in 1948 and then regained control of Jerusalem in 1967? To discuss this important topic, I'm glad to bring in now Bill Koenig, White House correspondent and founder and president of World Watch Daily, a news service that focuses on Israel, Jerusalem, the Middle East, and biblical prophecy. Bill is also author of the book, Eye to Eye, Facing the Consequences of Dividing Israel. And with that, let me welcome to the program here right now, Bill Koenig. Bill, thank you for being with us on the program today.
Thank you, Sam. Always a pleasure.
Bill, God's put you in a unique space, and you do two roles. I mentioned it. One, you're dealing with the Middle East with World Watch Daily, and then watch.org is the website. And you get into other things as a White House correspondent. We'll deal with that later. I want to stay on the Middle East here now today. And just for the sake, before we get into the impact and the details of the Abrahamic Accord, I want to cover another major point. On our previous two programs, we covered with you what you had done on the book Eye to Eye, the consequences to the nation, primarily U.S. presidents in the past who have sought to do things seeking peace, but ultimately walked into a trap where ultimately they worked against God and God sent judgment to this nation. We have unfolding in this nation now COVID and a host of other things going on. So here's my question to you right off. Is the COVID plague and the resulting impacts that we've seen that have rocked our nation, frankly, rocked the entire world, is there anything about them that you can logically, clearly tie into, for instance, the broader plan of the Peace to Prosperity initiative and so forth? Put those two together as we establish this program today.
Yes, I believe so, Sam. I wrote a commentary, Life Before January 28th, when the President Trump, established his plan and introduced his Peace to Prosperity plan to the world. And also, a couple hours after he presented the plan at the White House on January 28th, he posted his map that basically superimposes the map of Genesis 15:18. And then life after January 28th. Sam, these are two different worlds, life before January 28th and life after January 28th. And I might add, we've had no American president do more for the state of Israel than President Trump. Matter of fact, you can add up all the things that previous presidents have done. They don't even add up to what President Trump has done. But his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, pushed this plan. We heard from the beginning, the deal of the century, but this plan was established. He's the architect. Jared Kushner's the architect, and life as we know it has affected the United States and also the international community, who also came out with their plan, the UN resolutions. So as 3.5 billion people went into lockdowns in their homes, we all can look back to that January 28th and the next week or two after that, as the world came under a form of judgment for attempting to come up with its own plan on how to divide the covenant land of Israel.
All right, so what you are saying is that, yes, indeed, the turmoil we're seeing in this world, in part COVID and so forth, has affected the world, it's affected the United States, and you're saying it is traceable, directly connected to the January 28th, I think, announcement about the peace effort. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to use that to establish the program today. There is a connection. It is consistent with what Bill has called out in previous years in his book, Eye to Eye. And when we come back, we're going to slide into and talk now more specifically the Abrahamic Accords as it has come out of that and then produced other impact. We'll be back in just a moment.
Truth, flexible or permanent? The Bible, ancient history, or powerfully relevant? Culture, a reflection of enlightenment or warning signs? The pastor, commentator, or frontline combatant? Every day, American Pastors Network speaks to these questions where and when they matter. With hundreds of affiliate radio stations nationwide, a website and mobile app screening today's headlines through the twin lenses of the Bible and the Constitution, educating, informing, equipping. This is the American Pastors Network. The time is now to stand in the gap for truth.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap. And as we talk with our good friend Bill Koenig about what's going on in the Middle East, I think many Christians are observing what's happening and they're saying, I've been praying for Jerusalem. I'm praying for peace in the Middle East. And I'm so excited to see a president that has done so much for Israel. And they look at the peace to prosperity and now these other countries, these Arab countries coming to make peace with Israel. And they see the Abrahamic Accord. And I think a lot of Christians, a lot of evangelicals are kind of cheering, saying, look, this is wonderful. But Bill, could you kind of delve into this and go below just the surface and below just kind of the media blitz that's been out there and talk about what's actually in it and maybe show us what could be or definitely is problematic, maybe some of the top issues that are really problems going on behind the scenes, so to speak?
Well, good question, Isaac. And I think the important thing here is we really have two plans. We have the January 28th Peace to Prosperity Plan that was introduced at the White House by President Trump with Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel in attendance. And then the effort was beginning in Israel to extend sovereignty over 30% of Judea and Samaria, which is 132 settlement communities in Israel. For us, no land should be given up because, unfortunately, the Peace to Prosperity Plan also talked about giving up 70 to 80% to a future Palestinian state, whether they accepted the boundaries or not. What happened is the international community went absolute bonkers over the fact that the Trump administration, along with Israel, was going to extend sovereignty over 30% of Judea and Samaria. So what happened is the international community, it was one leader after another from Europe, from Russia, through the Middle East. They came against this extended sovereignty plan with great vigor. So what happened is Jared Kushner started working with United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and a few other countries about normalizing relations with Israel. And even in the last couple of weeks at the UN and other meetings, the U.A.E. and Bahrain said, the main purpose of the normalization was to stop Israel's annexation efforts. They also wanted to have a closer relationship with Israel, which they had appreciated since the Iran nuclear deal, because Obama was basically saying, Sunnis, you can fend for yourself, and the Sunni Arab countries in the Middle East were very concerned about Iran. So what happened is these relationships developed in intelligence and defense. And what happened over this period of 5 years since 2015 is really, in a lot of ways, Israel's developed really good relationships with other Sunni Arab countries, or with Sunni Arab countries. And but the problem with the Abraham Accords, the big problem with the Accords is it stops Israel's right to extend sovereignty. They have said that it at least puts it on hold for 4 years. And what has happened is the Peace to Prosperity plan of Trump-Kushner is now starting to evolve into the Arab peace initiatives, which was based on the UN resolutions of 242, UN Security Council resolutions. That's my concern, is all of a sudden any talk of Israel's extended sovereignty over this land has been stopped by the Abraham Accords.
So what you're bringing up, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us, because you've been on this program and on our radio program explaining these things. Many experts have been telling us some of this, but it's kind of unfolded in such a way that it kind of comes across as positive. Something you've talked about on this program many times, though, is that there are consequences for touching the land of Israel, for trying to take what God has given to Israel and to try to do anything to take it away. What do we see coming out of just these recent negotiations, these recent countries coming together? And again, it's being put out there as a very positive thing. What do we see happening to our country for our part in negotiating peace that at the expense of pausing, the settlements, taking basically land away from Israel? What has the result been towards us? You already talked about the original, the Peace to Prosperity COVID connection. Are we seeing different connections and relationships now to the later agreements?
Well, and you made a good point in your other question, Isaac. There are a lot of Christians. They're very excited about the fact that Israel's making peace with Arabs. Very excited about that. But what I continue to emphasize, it is using God's land, his boundaries, his promise. The God of Israel, through the Abrahamic covenant, did not plan biblically and prophetically for an Arab state to be in Judea and Samaria. And that's what the Arab peace initiatives speak of. Arab Peace Initiative 2002, sponsored by the Saudis, are the UN resolutions. And even the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan speaks of a future Palestinian state. And so on the surface, it's great. We have Israel making peace with Arabs, Sunni Arabs, and I might add that. But nonetheless, we've had recent major catastrophic events that happened. Hurricane Laura began a couple hours after President Trump at the White House said that they would be looking at selling F-35 stealth bombers to the United Arab Emirates, and also that the United States was helping Israel and the Saudis talk about a possible agreement as well. Within a couple hours, Hurricane Laura began. It became a massive storm, and it was coming ashore as President Pence was speaking in his acceptance speech at the GOP convention, and it also was a major focus. It was the first thing that President Trump mentioned the next day when he accepted his nomination. He spoke of Hurricane Laura immediately. And then we had Hurricane Sally right after President Trump stated on 9/11, on September 11th, that the United States had just brokered a deal between Israel and Bahrain. Within a couple hours, Hurricane Sally developed, became a massive storm, and came ashore, was in the process of coming ashore on the day the Abraham Accords agreement with Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain were being signed at the White House. And then the next day, Hurricane Sally came ashore, and when you look at the screenshots of both days, on the 15th of September and the 16th of September, it was about the Abraham Accords agreement at the White House and Hurricane Sally. And after research, we found out Sally is a derivative of Sarah of the Bible. And it was interesting to me because when I pondered and prayed about this, I felt like, isn't this amazing? I mean, that hurricane could have been called anything. But the fact we had Hurricane Sally, which is a derivative of Sarah, coming ashore, being the focus of the White House and being the focus of the country, to me was showing that the Abraham Accords, the land God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants, were meant for them, not the offspring of Ishmael.
And Bill, those connections, again, people say, wow, isn't that really something? Our viewers could be saying, that's interesting, but are you reaching too far? Are you assuming too much? And if perhaps, Bill, it was only this connection in regard to the Abrahamic covenant. And then, as you established earlier, peace for prosperity back on January 28th. If it were only those two, that would be a harder case to make. But in your book, Eye to Eye, when you go all the way back, really, in previous presidents, it is just a continuation of the same evidence. Bear down, if you could, just a little bit more, why it is so important to God and why it's logical or biblical to look and connect these dots relative to God telling any nation or any people what they should do or don't do relative to his nation of Israel. I mean, obviously these are connected. Establish that again for folks who may be listening or watching for the first time and say, I've never heard this kind of connection. Make the connection there again.
Well, Sam, that's a great point. I've been following this closely for over 20 years, and we have 134 record-setting catastrophes. I mean, these are the largest events in the history of the United States. Massive hurricanes, massive tornado outbreaks, earthquakes, and the 9/11 terror event. A couple quick ones here. The perfect storm was sending 30-foot waves into George Herbert Walker Bush's home in Kennebunkport, Maine, in October of '91, as he's starting the Land for Peace process, calling on Israel to give the land that they obtained in the 1967 Six-Day War. 9/11. On 9/10, President Bush, George W. Bush, was completing his negotiations with Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia on what was going to be the two-state plan. And I have all the documentation of what was completed by a Washington Post article that the plan was completed on 9/10, and then 9/11 happened. And we had 15 of the 19 terrorists that produced 9/11 were Saudis. And then Hurricane Katrina began within a couple hours after 9,500 Jews had been forced from their homes in Israel in August of 2005. And Sam, these are 134 record-setting events, and I've also noticed the greater the pressure on Israel to give up their covenant land, the greater the corresponding catastrophe. Most of these events have happened in the United States because we've been the point man in the peace process, but they've also happened to the UK, Germany, France as well, but a majority have happened here. And I mean, we've never had anything like COVID-19. I mean, this has paralyzed our country, and there was so much favor on President Trump prior to January 28th. I mean, so many things were going well for him. He was doing so many things that blessed Christians. He was such a great friend of Israel. But when he came out with his own plan and his own map that Jared Kushner had been the architect of, life in America has changed dramatically. And you can also look at what's happened in Israel. The parallel events in the United States and Israel continue. And again, Sam, Hurricane Sally, the fact that it was named, its derivative is a derivative of Sarah, and coming ashore at the time that the Abraham Accords are being negotiated and signed at the White House is very significant. So I think once people get used to watching these events, and again, these are the biggest in the history of our country, the more they can become better watchmen themselves and see the parallel to U.S. pressure or international pressure on Israel to divide their land and the corresponding catastrophes.
Bill, that was very, very good. And I got to take this another step here. We have in our country, at the time of this program right now, and you only have about a couple minutes left here, we have fires going on the West Coast. We have a number of other major things happening in this country. Are they connected? And then one quick question beyond it. These are things that are happening in rapid succession. What needs to be done? Is there anything that can be done nationally that can back these off? What needs to be done in relationship to the agreement with Israel? How should this should it be addressed here?
Well, that's a good question, Sam, and good points as well. We've done everything we can to lobby the White House, so to speak. We've documented, whether it was George W. Bush or the Obama administration, but especially right now, we have put an extensive effort at warning the White House and the State Department, and even the ambassador, U.S. Ambassador Israel Friedman, of the consequences. They have the book, they have Eye to Eye, but it's they've been so wrapped up in this process And COVID was like nothing else. I mean, it wasn't a hurricane, a tropical storm, or a major tornado outbreak. They've heard it, they understand it, they've heard what we've had to say. But I think COVID-19 just came out of nowhere, Sam. It's been devastating to the United States. Look what's happening in Israel. It has been a catastrophe of enormous proportion, even to the world. But I think the key here, as far as the heat, the record heat that Israel had was parallel to the record heat that we had in the western United States at the time. Jared Kushner was in Israel, working with Israel on the way to the Sunni countries. We had the parallel record heat. We had the highest temperature in 120 years of history in Jerusalem. We had the highest temperatures in Death Valley, California, and other parts of the West at the time Kushner is traveling the Middle East for a period of a week. And then after unfortunately, after the heat, the fires ended up building. But the main thing I focused on there was the record heat in the United States and Israel at the time that Kushner was traveling the Middle East. And
Bill, again, one more emphasis. Thank you for making that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come back in just a second and try and wrap this up with a little bit of some solution. Kind of, again, what do we do? A little bit more of what Bill was just talking about. How do we respond to this? God is in control, and that is what we need to be aware, and God is focusing on Israel, and we as God's people need to be focusing on His Word and connecting these dots as we're trying to do today. We'll be right back.
Stand in the Gap is produced and recorded in the studios of WBPH Philadelphia, positively different television.
Welcome back to Stand in the Gap, and I'm going to go right to Bill. We've just learned so much from you again today. James chapter 1, it tells us, it really warns us to be doers of the word, not hearers only. For everyone watching us today, we've listened to a lot of information from you today. What can we do?
Well, Isaac, I think we're living in the most important time in Bible prophecy history. It's exciting. It really is. None of this is a surprise. God is very serious about the land of Israel and His people. We do know that eventually there will be a final day covenant of Daniel 9:27. The Antichrist will come forward with a solution. We continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, but I think what we continue to acknowledge is the fact that God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in this land for them to live on and to live with, and it's not for anybody else. So I think that's what's important, that we fully understand the biblical significance of the days we're living in, and what to watch is watchmen on the wall.
Well, thank you, Bill. Sam, what would you add to that as we wrap this up? I mean, how can we do something about all this information that we get, biblical information?
Well, Isaac, I think that's a great question, and Bill, I appreciate how you responded on that. But ladies and gentlemen, when we deal with issues on this program, the idea is to take a biblical worldview, we call it, God's view of what's happening around us, so that we can understand and put into context and perspective that what is happening is not by accident. What is happening with Israel is never by accident. And as the world's eyes are drawn to this nation, this city, this people, and the United States having been a blessed part of helping Israel to come into existence and to be furthered along, it is a part of God's plan, but God is no respecter of persons, and you can't tamper with God's boundaries, you can't tamper with God's promises, and you can't tamper with God's people without consequences occurring, and that's what Bill's book, Eye to Eye, is all about. So thank you for watching us today. We're already at the end. We're glad that you are with us and watching us. And I would encourage you this week, if this program has touched your heart, and so many I know are contacting us, God is speaking to you and encouraging you through this program, let us know. Go to our website. It's there on the end of the screen in just a moment. Contact us. Partner with us in prayer. Very important. Partner with us in your financial giving. That is so critical. That's just the way things work. And if God is blessing you, be a blessing to us and allowing so many other people across the country to be able to hear and participate and be strengthened in their walk with God. So until we come back and see you next week, stand in the gap for truth where you are.